Marianne Aldecott had rehearsed the apology for 2 weeks, in front of her own looking-glass, in the carriage on the long drive north, and once more, under her breath, in the entrance hall of Sherbrooke House, while a footman went to see whether His Grace would receive her at all. She had every word of it ready. She did not get to use a single one. Your Grace. She sank into the correct depth of curtsy the moment she was shown into the library, and kept her eyes down, as her mother had instructed, because a woman begging pardon on her family's behalf did not meet a wronged duke's gaze as though she were his equal. I have come on behalf of my father, Sir Walter Aldecott, who is not well enough to travel and too ashamed, in any case, to face you himself. And I have come to offer, as fully and as humbly as words permit, my family's apology for the grievous wrong done to you this past winter. Sit down, Miss Aldecott. Your Grace, if you would permit me to finish, I would rather you sat down first. You have travelled 60 miles for this, and I find I cannot in good conscience let you deliver a rehearsed speech standing in my doorway like a tradesman presenting an invoice. Aubrey Vale, 9th Duke of Sherbrooke, rose from behind his desk and drew out a chair himself, which no duke she had ever heard of troubled to do for a disgraced baronet's daughter. Please, Marianne sat, because there was nothing else to do with a duke's direct instruction, and found, with the particular horror of a woman who has spent 2 weeks perfecting a script only to have the stage rearranged beneath her, that she had entirely lost her place. The wrong itself had unfolded the previous December, and it had very nearly cost the Duke of Sherbrooke a season's worth of standing among the men whose good opinion mattered most to a peer's financial affairs. Sir Walter Aldecott, Marianne's father, had lost heavily to the Duke at cards the year before, an ordinary enough occurrence among gentlemen who played for stakes rather higher than their pride generally accounted for, and had gone, in the months following, to a moneylender named Edmund Slate for the funds to cover it, a transaction Slate had conducted with the particular patient cruelty of a man who profits considerably more from a debtor's continued indebtedness than from its swift repayment. Slate had told Sir Walter, in the autumn, a carefully constructed lie, that the Duke of Sherbrooke had, in fact, reneged privately on a gambling debt of his own to a third gentleman, and that the whole of society's admiration for Sherbrooke's honour rested on nobody having yet discovered it. Sir Walter, humiliated by his own debt and eager for any story that might diminish the man he owed it to, had repeated the tale, first at his own club, then more widely, until by November it had travelled through half the gentlemen's clubs in London, and had begun, in the particular way such stories do, to attach itself permanently to the Duke's reputation, regardless of its truth. It was false in every particular. The Duke of Sherbrooke had never reneged on a debt in his life, and the third gentleman named in the story. When finally located and questioned by Sherbrooke's own solicitor, had sworn he had never made any such claim to Sir Walter or to anyone else. Edmund Slate had invented the whole of it, calculating, correctly, that a humiliated debtor, eager to feel less humiliated, would carry a convenient lie a very great distance without troubling to verify it. The truth had come out by January, painstakingly, through witnesses and correspondence Sherbrooke's solicitor had assembled with considerable patience, and Sir Walter Aldecott had been left, by February, thoroughly exposed as the source of a slander he could not prove and had never troubled to confirm, ruined in the same drawing-rooms that had once received him readily, his family's standing collapsed alongside his own. I do not believe you came here today to recite a speech at me, Miss Aldecott, the Duke said, once she was seated, watching her with an attention that unsettled her considerably more than cold dismissal would have. I believe your mother sent you because your father cannot face what he has done, and because a family in disgrace must be seen to make some gesture of contrition or risk being shut out of society entirely, and I believe you have spent 2 weeks memorizing exactly the words that gesture requires. I find I have very little interest in hearing them. Then what would you have me say, Your Grace? I would have you tell me the truth, in your own words, rather than the words your mother rehearsed with you. What do you actually think happened, Miss Aldecott? Not what you have been instructed to apologize for. What you yourself believe. Marianne sat very still for a long moment, the careful architecture of her prepared speech entirely useless against a question nobody in her family had thought to prepare her for. I think my father was cheated by a man cleverer and crueler than himself, she said finally, slowly, feeling her way toward an honesty she had not expected to need. I think Mr. Slate told him a convenient lie at the precise moment my father was most desperate to believe something that made his own humiliation smaller, and I think my father, God forgive him, wanted the lie to be true badly enough that he never once troubled to ask whether it actually was. I do not say that to excuse him, Your Grace. He repeated a slander that cost you a season's reputation and very nearly cost you considerably more, and he did it out of his own wounded pride rather than any care for whether it was just. I think he is guilty of exactly what he has been accused of. I only think the guilt has a shape more pathetic than malicious, and I am not certain that distinction changes what is owed you, but I find I cannot in honesty pretend it away. The Duke of Sherbrooke was quiet a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not entirely read. That is the first entirely honest account of this business anyone has offered me since December, he said. Everyone else has told me either that your father is a villain who deserves whatever ruin follows, or that he is an innocent victim of Slate's scheming who bears no fault himself. You are the first person to tell me both things are true at once, which I find is considerably closer to how the world actually works than either simpler version. May I ask you something in return, Your Grace, since you have declined the apology I came to give? You may. Why did you decline it? I do not ask to be difficult. I ask because I do not understand, and I find I would rather understand than simply be grateful for an escape I cannot account for. Aubrey Vale considered the question with the same careful attention he had given her own answer. Because I have spent 3 months being apologized to by people who never troubled to examine what actually happened, Miss Aldecott, and I find I have grown rather weary of accepting contrition that costs the giver nothing beyond the saying of it. You rehearsed a speech for 2 weeks that would have cost you nothing at all beyond your own discomfort in delivering it, and I find I did not want that. I wanted to know whether a single member of your family had actually looked honestly at what happened, rather than simply performed the correct degree of shame for it. He set down the pen he had been turning in his hands. You are the first to manage it. I would like you to stay for tea, Miss Aldecott, if you have no urgent reason to return to the carriage immediately. Marianne looked at him with an expression that made plain how thoroughly this request had exceeded anything her mother's careful instructions had prepared her for. Your Grace, I do not think my mother anticipated this outcome when she sent me. I do not imagine she did. I find I did not entirely anticipate it myself until you sat down and declined to simply recite at me. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. Stay for tea, Miss Aldecott. I find I have a great many more honest questions I would like answered, and I have discovered in the last quarter hour that you are considerably more interesting to talk with than the apology I expected to receive. The tea itself arrived with a housekeeper who could not entirely hide her own astonishment at the sight of her master pouring for a guest at all. Aubrey Vale was not. she confided to Marianne years later, a duke who often troubled himself with visitors beyond the necessary business of the estate. And the sight of him drawing out a second chair for a young woman nobody in the household had. Expected to stay past the length of a formal apology was, by the housekeeper's own account, the most talked about event in the servants' hall that whole winter. "You will forgive the household staring, Miss Aldecott," Aubrey said, catching the direction of her glance toward the door, where a footman had lingered rather longer than strictly necessary refilling the coal scuttle. "I do not receive many guests for tea. I find, since my own father's death, that I have grown rather better at managing an estate's ledgers than its ordinary hospitality. I do not mind the staring, Your Grace. I have had considerably more searching looks aimed at me this past winter than a curious footman's glance." She allowed herself, for the first time since arriving, something close to a real smile, though I confess I am rather curious what a duke does with his afternoons, if not entertain the daughters of men who have wronged him. Mostly I read estate correspondence and argue with my steward about drainage, which I promise you is precisely as thrilling as it sounds. Something eased in his face, answering her small attempt at lightness with an unguarded warmth she had not expected from a man 3 months into recovering his own battered reputation. "I find I have rather enjoyed this afternoon's alternative considerably more." She stayed a full hour, and then, at his quiet insistence, a second, and by the time the carriage finally carried her back toward the family's much-reduced townhouse, Marianne Aldecott found she had told the Duke of Sherbrooke considerably more about her own life than she had told anyone in months, about the particular grief of watching her father's disgrace unmake a household that had once been merely modest and was now genuinely poor, about her 2 younger brothers withdrawn from school for want of fees, about her own prospects, once reasonably good, now collapsed alongside everything else her father's slander had cost the family. "You have lost a great deal for a wrong you did not commit," Aubrey observed, near the end of that second hour. "I do not think that arithmetic troubles anyone very much, Your Grace. A family's disgrace falls on the whole family, guilty or not, and I have found there is very little use protesting the unfairness of it. One simply manages what remains. I find I would like to help you manage it, if you would permit me. I do not think you owe my family anything further, Your Grace, given what my father has already cost you. I am not offering out of obligation, Miss Aldecott. I am offering because I have spent 2 hours in your company discovering that the woman sent to apologize for her family's disgrace has borne it with more honesty and more grace than the family itself has managed, and I find I would like the chance to know you further, entirely apart from whatever debt your father's conduct might otherwise suggest I am settling." Lady Aldecott received the news of the Duke's first proper call with an anxiety that took Marianne some patience to untangle. "You cannot mean to encourage this, Marianne. If he calls and it comes to nothing, the whole of London will say the Duke of Sherbrooke looked us over and found us wanting a second time, and I do not know that this family survives being humiliated twice by the same man. He is not calling to inspect us for further faults, Mamma. He is calling because I answered a question honestly, and he found the answer worth hearing again." Marianne kept her voice gentle, though the anxious circling of her mother's fear was by then a familiar and rather exhausting pattern in that house. "I understand you are frightened of what another disappointment might cost us. I am asking you to trust that I did not achieve this by performing anything. I achieved it by refusing to perform at all, and I do not intend to start now merely because you are afraid of what might happen if I stop." Lady Aldecott did not entirely stop worrying, she was, Marianne reflected privately, constitutionally unable to stop worrying about anything since December. But she managed with visible effort to receive the Duke's subsequent calls with something approaching her old composure. And by the third week she had begun, cautiously, to hope alongside her daughter rather than merely fear on her behalf. He called at the Aldecott townhouse the following week, and the week after, and Marianne's mother, bewildered at first by a courtship that had begun from the ashes of the family's worst disgrace, came to understand, over the following month, that her daughter had achieved through plain honesty what 2 weeks of rehearsed contrition had never been designed to accomplish. Sir Walter himself, still too ashamed to receive the Duke in person for some weeks, finally agreed to a meeting in March, and it was, by all accounts, a considerably harder conversation than his daughter's had been. "I do not ask your forgiveness, Your Grace," Sir Walter said, unable to fully meet the Duke's eyes even seated across his own drawing room. "I ask only that you understand I have spent 3 months considering exactly what kind of man believes a convenient lie, because the truth wounds his pride too badly to examine, and I have not liked the answer. I do not offer easy forgiveness, Sir Walter, because I do not think it would mean anything if I did. I offer instead the observation that your daughter has done more to repair what you damaged than any speech of yours could have, and I find myself, against every reasonable expectation I held in December, considerably more interested in what your family might become than in what it has already cost me." Sir Walter sat with that a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had roughened considerably. "I do not know how to be the kind of man my daughter has proven herself to be, Your Grace. I have spent 40 years believing pride was the same thing as dignity, and I have watched, this winter, precisely what the difference actually costs a family when the two are confused for long enough." He looked, for the first time in the conversation, directly at the Duke rather than at some point past his shoulder. "I do not ask you to think well of me. I ask only that whatever you build with Marianne, you build it knowing she earned every particle of your good opinion herself, at considerable cost, while the rest of us stood by and let her carry it. I am aware of exactly how much she has carried, Sir Walter. I do not intend to let her carry it alone a day longer than necessary." The courtship that followed through that spring was conducted, by unspoken agreement between them, with a plainness that suited them both. No elaborate performances, no calculated gestures designed for an audience of watching drawing rooms. Only the accumulating evidence of two people who had discovered, in the worst circumstances either could have chosen, that they preferred each other's honesty to anyone else's careful flattery. Aubrey took her walking in the Sherbrooke Gardens most weeks, and told her, over the course of those walks, considerably more about his own father's difficult final years than he had ever told anyone outside his own solicitor. A man who had, in his own way, taught his son to distrust easy apologies by offering a great many insincere ones himself across a long, disappointing marriage. I watched my mother apologize to my father for offences she had never committed, for the whole of my childhood, simply to keep the peace in a house that had very little peace to keep, he told Marianne. On one such walk, the spring flowers just beginning along the garden wall. "I think that is rather why your rehearsed apology troubled me so thoroughly the first afternoon you came here. I recognized the shape of it immediately, a woman performing contrition she had been instructed to feel, regardless of what she actually believed underneath it, and I found I could not bear to watch it happen to someone else, not in my own library, not over a wrong that was never truly hers to apologize for in the first place. I am sorry for whatever your mother endured." "So am I. I find, though, that watching you refuse to simply perform for me has done rather more to heal that particular old wound than any amount of sympathy ever managed." He took her hand, briefly, among the new blooms. You did not know you were doing it that first afternoon. I do not think that makes it any less remarkable. It was in April that Edmund Slate, learning of the Duke's growing attachment to the very family whose ruin he had engineered, made his final and most dangerous move. He came to Marianne directly, at a private assembly, cornering her near the refreshment table with the particular oily confidence of a man who believes he still holds every advantage. Miss Aldecott, I confess I am surprised to find you so comfortably received by the Duke of Sherbrooke, given the circumstances of your family's disgrace. I am aware you engineered those circumstances, Mr. Slate, and I would ask you to consider carefully before you say another word to me tonight, because I have discovered a great deal since December about exactly how convenient your original tale to my father actually was. Slate's smile did not falter. A dangerous accusation to make in a crowded room, Miss Aldecott, with no proof behind it. I have proof enough, sir. I have spent the last month, with His Grace's solicitor's considerable assistance, tracing the exact chain of your own debts to my father's original loan, and I have found that you stood to profit a very great deal from keeping Sir Walter perpetually indebted to you, and that a duke's reputation, ruined by a convenient slander, would have made it considerably harder for my father to ever recover his own credit and repay you in full, leaving you free to press the debt at whatever punishing terms suited you for years to come. Marianne's voice did not shake, though the effort of holding it steady cost her considerably. You did not tell my father that lie to comfort him, Misty. Slate, you told it to keep him exactly where you wanted him, indebted, humiliated, and too ashamed of his own gullibility to ever examine your own role in his ruin too closely. Slate's composure finally cracked, just slightly, and he glanced around the crowded room with the particular calculating unease of a man realizing his advantage had quietly evaporated while he was not watching for it. You cannot prove any of that, Miss Aldecott. I can, in fact, because His Grace's solicitor has spent a month examining your own ledgers, obtained quite properly through the courts once a magistrate agreed there was sufficient cause to suspect fraudulent inducement in your dealings with my father. I would ask you to consider, Mr. Slate, whether you would rather discuss the particulars here, at this assembly, in front of every gentleman whose good opinion your own business depends upon, or whether you would prefer to discuss them with the magistrate directly, in a rather less public setting. Slate did not leave without one further attempt to salvage his position, and it was, in its way, the most dangerous move he made in the whole business. He went to Aubrey's own solicitor 2 days after the assembly, offering to withdraw quietly from London and trouble no one further, provided the Duke agreed not to pursue the magistrate's inquiry, a bargain calculated. Marianne understood the moment she heard of it to protect Slate from prosecution while leaving her father's original disgrace only half corrected in the public eye. Since a quiet withdrawal would never carry the same weight as a proven fraud exposed in open court. You must not agree to it, she told Aubrey, the evening the offer reached him. I know it would be simpler. I know a quiet withdrawal costs you nothing further and spares everyone the unpleasantness of a public proceeding. But my father's name will never be fully cleared if Slate is simply permitted to vanish rather than be shown, plainly, to have manufactured the whole of it. I had already decided against it before you said a word, Aubrey told her. I find I have grown rather tired of convenient quiet, Marianne, in every particular of this business. I would rather have the whole of it examined in the light, however unpleasant, than let one more piece of it go unexamined the way the original slander did. The magistrate's inquiry proceeded despite Slate's offer, and the evidence, the ledgers, the timeline of his own debts to third parties that Sir Walter's ruin would have conveniently obscured, The sworn statement from the gentleman falsely named in the original tale proved comprehensive enough that Slate fled London before the proceeding could conclude with a formal charge. His flight itself serving as confirmation to every drawing-room that had once doubted Sir Walter's claim of innocence. Edmund Slate left London within the month, his own reputation as a moneylender collapsing considerably faster than Sir Walter's had once fallen, once the truth of his manufactured slander became known through the same clubs that had originally carried his lie. And Sir Walter Aldecott, cleared at last of having invented the tale himself rather than merely been deceived by it, found his own path back into society's good opinion considerably smoother than it had seemed possible in the depths of that terrible winter. "You did that yourself," Aubrey said to Marianne, the evening the whole business finally concluded, finding her in her mother's drawing-room with the satisfaction of a genuinely difficult thing properly finished. "I offered my solicitor's assistance, but the tracing of it, the confrontation at the assembly, that was entirely your own doing. I did not come to you 2 months ago intending to become anyone's rescued damsel, your Grace. I came to apologise for a wrong my family caused, and I find, having stayed for tea instead, that I would rather earn whatever comes next than simply receive it." Marianne met his eyes steadily. "You asked me, that first afternoon, what I actually believed, rather than what I had been instructed to say. I have found I rather like being the kind of woman who answers that question honestly. And I do not intend to stop now that the crisis has passed." He proposed to her in June, in the same library where she had once tried and failed to deliver a rehearsed apology, and he did it with the same plain directness that had first undone her prepared speech. "I asked you a question the first day you came to this room, Marianne, and you gave me the first entirely honest answer I had received in 3 months of careful, exhausting apologies. I find I have spent every day since wanting to ask you a great many more questions, entirely apart from your family's disgrace, because I discovered that first afternoon that the woman sent to apologise on everyone else's behalf was considerably more remarkable than the apology itself. That is not quite a proposal, Your Grace. I am aware. I find the important questions have grown rather harder to ask plainly, the longer I have known exactly how much I want the right answer." He took her hand. "Marry me. Not to settle your family's debt to mine, which was settled months ago in every particular that actually mattered. Marry me because I asked you to stay for tea on the worst afternoon of your life, and I have not once, in 4 months since, wanted you to leave. They were married that autumn at the small church nearest Sherbrooke rather than any grander chapel the dukedom might have claimed, because Marianne had asked for exactly that plainness, and Aubrey had agreed without a moment's hesitation, having learned by then that plainness was rather the whole foundation their entire acquaintance had been built upon. Sir Walter Aldecott walked his daughter down the aisle with a composure that had cost him a hard winter's reckoning to earn back, and told the assembled guests afterward, in a small, unrehearsed speech that surprised everyone who remembered how thoroughly disgrace had once silenced him, that he considered it the great mercy of his life that the daughter he had very nearly ruined by his own. Foolish pride had turned out to possess more honest character than he had ever managed to teach her. I do not say that to excuse myself, he added, his voice not quite steady. I say it because a man ought to be permitted, once in his life, to admit plainly that his child has become someone considerably better than he deserved to raise. And I find I have waited far too long to say it to her directly, rather than merely think it in private shame. Lady Aldecott wept through the whole of the ceremony, and admitted afterward to anyone who asked that she had spent the better part of a year believing her family's ruin permanent, and that watching her daughter marry a duke who had chosen her entirely on the strength of her own honest character, had taught her more about resilience than the whole of the preceding winter's careful anxious management ever had. The following spring, Marianne Vale, Duchess of Sherbrooke, kept in her own writing desk a single sheet of paper, folded and much handled, on which 2 weeks of a rehearsed apology were written out in her own careful hand, every word she had prepared and never used, the speech her mother had helped her polish. Kept not out of sentiment for its content, but as a reminder of exactly how close she had come to reciting a performance instead of telling the truth. "You could throw that away, you know," Aubrey said one evening, finding her reading over the old page with a private, amused expression. "You have not needed it in over a year." "I have needed it every day of that year, Aubrey, not to recite, to remember." She folded it away again, careful as ever. "I keep it because it reminds me what I very nearly became that afternoon, a woman who said exactly what she was told to say, and left this house having changed nothing at all. I would rather remember how close I came to that, and be grateful every single day that you asked me a different question instead." Their own daughter, born the following spring and already, at not yet a year old, possessed of her mother's watchful, unhurried patience, would grow up hearing the story told the same way every time it was asked for, not as a romance that began with an apology, but as a lesson in the particular courage it takes to set a rehearsed script aside and answer, instead, with whatever happens to be true. "You will tell her the whole of it, when she is old enough," Aubrey said, watching his wife tuck the old page back into its drawer, "including your father's part in it, and Slate's, and the 2 weeks you spent memorizing words you never got to use. I will tell her every particular of it, exactly as it happened, disgrace and all." Marianne closed the drawer. "I do not think a story is worth keeping if you sand off the parts that were difficult to live through. I would rather she know her mother very nearly recited a performance instead of telling the truth, and chose, at the last possible moment, to tell it anyway. I think that is a considerably more useful inheritance than a prettier version would ever manage to be."